feel how much I rely on other people for pretty much everything in my life. And some days that can even be a little scary. But what I'm here to talk to you about today is how that same interdependence is actually an extremely powerful social infrastructure that we can actually harness to help heal some of our deepest civic issues if we apply open source collaboration. A couple of years ago, I read an article by New York Times writer Michael Pollan, in which he argued that growing even some of our own food is one of the best things that we can do for the environment. Now, at the time that I was reading this, it was the middle of the winter, and I definitely did not have room for a lot of dirt in my New York City apartment. So I was basically just willing to settle for reading the next Wired magazine and finding out how the experts were going to figure out how to solve all these problems for us in the future. But that was actually exactly the point that Michael Pollan was making in this article, was it's precisely when we hand over the responsibility for all of these things to specialists that we cause the kind of messes that we see with the food system. So, I happen to know a little bit from my own work about how NASA has been using hydroponics to explore growing food in space, and that you can actually get optimal nutritional yield by running a kind of high-quality liquid soil over plants' root systems. Now, to a vegetable plant, my apartment has got to be about as foreign as outer space, but I can offer some natural light and year-round climate control. Fast forward 2 years later, we now have window farms, which are vertical hydroponic platforms for food growing indoors. And the way it works is that there's a pump at the bottom which periodically sends some of this liquid nutrient solution up to the top, which then trickles down through plants' root systems that are suspended in clay pellets, so there's no dirt involved. Now, light and temperature vary with each window's microclimate. So a window farm requires a farmer, and she must decide what kind of crops she is going to put in her window farm and whether she's going to feed her food organically. Back at the time, a window farm was no more than a technically complex idea that was going to require a lot of testing. And I really wanted it to be an open project because hydroponics is one of the fastest growing areas of patenting in the United States right now. Tony in Chicago has been taking on growing experiments like lots of other window farmers, and he's been able to actually get his strawberries to fruit for 9 months of the year in low light conditions by simply changing out the organic nutrients. And window farmers in Finland have been customizing their window farms for the dark days of the Finnish winters by outfitting them with LED grow lights that they're now making open source and part of the project. So window farms have been evolving through a rapid versioning process similar to software. And with every open source project, the real benefit is the interplay between the specific concerns of people customizing their systems for their own particular concerns and the universal concerns. If we really want to see the kind of wide consumer behavior change that we're all talking about as environmentalists and food people, maybe we just need to ditch the term consumer and get behind the people who are doing stuff. Open source projects tend to have a momentum of their own. And what we're seeing is that R&DIY has moved beyond just window farms and LEDs into solar panels and aquaponic systems. And we're building upon innovations of generations who went before us. And we're looking ahead at generations who really need us to retool our lives now. So we ask that you join us in rediscovering the value of Citizens United and to declare that we are all still pioneers.
So aquaponics really involves two very sustainable technologies in their own right. Aquaculture, or the ability to grow fish and aquatic organisms in water, as well as hydroponics, the growing of plants without soil. When we bring these two technologies together, we form aquaponics. The ultimate idea behind it is we take the wastes from the fish and we use that nutrient-rich water as a feed for the plants. The plants then in turn take up those nutrients, filtering the water for the fish before it returns back as clean and sustainable closed-loop system. Ultimately, it's about recycling wastes into resources. It's about creating ecosystems in areas where they otherwise wouldn't exist. It's about combining complementary technologies together to try and close the loop on food production. About promoting biodiversity, and ultimately about producing food. And it's producing food that I'm going to talk a little bit more about now, particularly pertinent in the lead up to lunch. If we look at a system, and a food production system in particular, in terms of its inputs and outputs, we can judge that system based on its ability to generate more from less. If we look first at aquaculture itself, we have a cycle where we take the fish wastes, we use nitrifying bacteria to convert those wastes, and also filtration systems to allow water to be recirculated within a system. We have a number of inputs to the system. Firstly, fish food. There are a number of sort of sustainability questions that I won't go into now about fish food, but the crux is around about 1.2 kilos to 1.4 kilos of fish food go in to produce 1 kilo of fish. They are the most efficient converters of protein in terms of farming livestock. We also have energy required to run water pumps and aeration to create an environment in which these animals can thrive and grow. And water. Recirculating aquaculture is actually very water efficient. It's defined by using only 10% of water every day. However, this 10% need to be replaced and topped up from time to time. If we then look at our outputs, we produce fish, obviously, vital for a balanced and healthy diet. And then if we go into the technology that I've devoted my life towards developing, short life so far anyway, aquaponics ultimately involves still using these nitrifying bacteria, converting toxic ammonia into nitrite and nitrates. The nitrate is then the nutrient that can be taken up by plants, especially leafy green crops. The result is we have another output from the system using the same amount of food and energy going in, but we also decrease the amount of water used within the system. So I guess by integrating other technologies as well into the system, which is a big part of our work, we can reduce the inputs that go in to produce these crops. I should also say, within an aquaponic system, it's possible to grow 30 to 50 kilos of vegetables for every kilo of fish that you produce. So by integrating vermiculture, or wormeries as many people know it as, we know that we can take the waste from fish and grow plants with them. But once we've grown those plants, we take the waste of those plants, whether it's the root system or the outer leaves, and put them into wormeries. From that, we can produce vermicompost to provide soil enrichment for soil-grown crops. Also, worm teas, which provide a biopesticide to spray onto the plants, as well as a foliar fertilizer. But most importantly, the worms themselves, these can be used as a feed source to then feed back into the fish. Thus, we reduce our inputs to the system and we increase our outputs. Another very useful method that I could go on about for about 18 minutes alone is black soldier flies, these incredible little creatures that outcompete the disease-carrying blue and green bottle maggots. But ultimately, we take the fish wastes, whether it's cooked or uncooked, the guts, the head, and the processing wastes, and put them into enclosures where soldier flies eat and turn that waste product into a usable, nice little packaged form of protein. And in fact, if you give these soldier flies a 30-degree ramp, they'll actually harvest themselves, falling straight into a fish tank, sort of almost lemming-like. Due to animal byproducts legislation, we can't actually take the waste from a fish, feed them to soldier flies, and feed those soldier flies back to fish. So we have to incorporate another animal into our ecosystem. However, we take the soldier flies that have fed from those fish to produce food to feed to chickens, and then we use the chicken waste to produce more soldier flies to feed back to the fish. The result is obviously more outputs and further lowering our inputs. Along with the chickens, we obviously also get eggs. Another example of integrating is giant freshwater prawns, an animal that we're currently working with to try and close the loop and add more value to the system. When we have this nutrient-rich water and light entering that water, we inevitably produce algae. That algae provides the food then for another animal in the chain, such as the giant freshwater prawn, which helps clean the water and provides a value-added addition to the system. Similarly, we can increase the resilience of the system as a whole to breed our fish, to produce eggs and then fry, to use to repopulate the system or to start seeding other systems. But I guess one of the major inputs that we still see here is energy. And by looking beyond food itself, incorporating other technologies here, such as solar photovoltaic, if we incorporate these ecosystems into a greenhouse or a building, for example, we can use the energy from the sun, harnessing and capturing it from solar photovoltaic sources to provide both a lowering of the energy costs that we need to put into the system, but also through feed-in tariffs, providing another output, another economic output of the system. Similarly, using biomass heating, if we use the same energy from the sun captured and stored within trees, we can basically burn those trees to provide heat, to heat up the water. And with a tropical ecosystem comes enhanced productivity, thus reducing our heat inputs even further. And we can, next to these systems, incorporate short rotation coppice to chip our own biomass to heat the water. The remaining input that we can see is dominant, even though relatively speaking it's actually quite low. But if we incorporate things like rainwater harvesting technologies alongside our systems, when the rain falls, as it inevitably does in this country, we can store that water and use it to then replace any of the losses that are either taken up by vegetables or lost through evaporation. So ultimately, we're decreasing the inputs to this system, or we're increasing the outputs by creating these closed-loop and dynamic ecosystems. Ultimately, aquaponics is really about creating more from less. We're subjected to some incredible images in the media about modern visions for urban agriculture by some of the leading architects in the world, and aquaponics fits within all of these systems. However, there's a slightly recurring theme that they seem a little bit far away from our current reality. So what I'm proposing really is that we explore our existing resources, we look at the buildings that we have in urban spaces, and we try and, whether it be for a 5-year period or for a 1-year period, we try and take those spaces over to grow food and to engage communities. On a daily basis, we are bombarded by opportunities from commercial operations, from communities, from councils, with resources in city centres that are currently being underutilised. These spaces all carry with it their own challenges, and not all of them are going to be suitable for urban agriculture. But I'm going to take you through some of the steps to show you really what we've done in the last few months. So we placed that in the front room of the building, and above that, put a chicken coop on the space on the flat roof above. We've got a damp, dark cellar, which is ideal for growing a wide variety of different mushroom species. Similarly, a polytunnel in the garden that shows people how food can be grown in a slightly different way, also using soil and using the compost that we create from the site. We need a kitchen, obviously, to process the food that we're producing, but also a cafe, the idea being that we can add value and we can create an offering to the many hundreds of people that come through the door. And a meeting room, that the idea of the meeting room really was to create a hub for like-minded individuals to come together around subjects of food, to share ideas and share aspirations for further development.